The rain wouldn't stop. It poured like the sky was weeping, heavy and endless. Every drop hit the ground with a sound too sharp, too loud, as if whispering a warning. Ethan wiped his face, blinking against the cold water. The road ahead was empty, streetlights flickering. His car had broken down miles ago, and now he was walking, soaking, shivering, alone. Then he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the road. Still. Watching. Not moving. Not breathing. And then it smiled. The stranger in the rain expanded. The night felt suffocating, as though the world was being drowned in an endless downpour. Ethan's car sputtered and died hours ago, leaving him stranded on an isolated stretch of highway, with only the glow of his headlights reflecting off the slick road. The storm had come out of nowhere, a sudden torrent that swallowed the horizon, obscuring everything around him in a thick, wet shroud. As he sat in his car, trying to restart the engine for the 5th time, a deep, guttural growl rumbled in his stomach, reminding him that he'd skipped dinner. But there was no way he was going to risk stepping outside in this storm to find something to eat, not in the middle of nowhere with no cell signal and no help in sight. He glanced out of the window, watching as the rain cascaded down, drenching the earth in a relentless onslaught. "This can't be happening," Ethan muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He tried the engine one more time. It coughed and sputtered, but nothing. He slammed his fist on the dashboard, cursing his bad luck. With a heavy sigh, he gave up. The car wasn't going anywhere, and there was nothing to do but wait. But waiting alone in a broken-down car on a dark road, in the middle of nowhere, was beginning to feel like a nightmare in itself. The rain was getting heavier. The sound of it pounding against the car roof was deafening now, almost drowning out the silence that surrounded him. Ethan reached for his phone, hoping for a signal. The screen was blank, no bars, nothing. He cursed again, this time under his breath, as he tossed the phone to the passenger seat. It was useless. His only option was to wait until morning or risk walking to the nearest town, which he estimated to be about 5 miles away. He wasn't in a rush. It wasn't like anything was going to change. But then he heard something. A noise. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was the sound of footsteps. The hairs on the back of Ethan's neck stood up, and his heart skipped a beat. He rolled down the window slightly, straining his ears. It was a soft sound, almost like the lightest tap of shoes against the wet road. No one should be out here. There was nothing for miles. He looked out into the gloom, squinting through the downpour. The headlights of the car barely cut through the darkness, but he thought he saw something, a figure, standing at the edge of the road. A flash of panic gripped him. His mind raced as he checked the mirrors, trying to see if anyone was near him, but the back seat was empty. The figure seemed to flicker in and out of sight, like it was dancing with the shadows. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He grabbed the door handle, ready to bolt, but a strange sense of curiosity held him in place. Who would be out here, in the middle of a storm, on this isolated stretch of highway? The figure seemed to move closer. Its shape shifted with the storm, appearing and disappearing between the flashes of lightning. Ethan's grip tightened on the wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. "No, this can't be happening," he whispered. And then, the figure stepped into the light. A tall man, soaked to the bone, wearing nothing but a tattered, old coat that clung to his frame like a second skin. His face was covered with dark hair, wet and clinging to his forehead. Ethan couldn't see his eyes, but he could feel the weight of his gaze, like someone was staring straight through him. The man took another step toward him, and Ethan froze, unsure of what to do. His heart beat so loudly in his ears that he was sure the stranger could hear it too. The rain kept falling, but for a brief moment, it seemed to slow down, as though the world was holding its breath. The stranger stopped just a few feet from Ethan's window, not moving. "You shouldn't be out here," the stranger said, his voice low, distorted, like it was warped by the storm itself. Ethan's hand was shaking as he reached for the window to roll it up, but his fingers fumbled, unable to find the button. I'm just trying to get to town," he stammered, his voice shaky. "My car broke down. I can't get it started." The stranger didn't respond at first. He just stood there, staring into the car, his wet clothes glistening in the dim light. Ethan could feel the cold creep into his bones as he looked at him, a sense of dread beginning to form in the pit of his stomach. There was something not right about this man, something wrong in the way he stood, like he wasn't really a part of the world around him. Finally, the man spoke again, his voice even softer now. "Then you shouldn't have come this way." Ethan's heart skipped a beat, and he could feel his hands growing clammy. He pulled at the door handle, wanting to leave, wanting to get away from this man. But his legs wouldn't move. It was like something was holding him in place. The stranger slowly tilted his head, a movement that felt unnatural. The rain seemed to stop falling around him, as though he was in a bubble, untouched by the downpour. Ethan's breath quickened. He didn't know what was happening, but it felt like everything was spiraling out of control. The stranger leaned in, so close now that his breath fogged up the glass. Ethan recoiled in terror, his eyes locked on the stranger's face. And that's when he saw it. A smile. It wasn't a normal smile. It was wide, too wide, stretching across the stranger's face in an unnatural curve, exposing sharp, yellow teeth. It looked like something out of a nightmare. The smile grew bigger, spreading across the man's face like it was tearing his skin apart. Ethan's breath caught in his throat, his mind screaming at him to run, to do anything to get away from this thing. Before he could react, the stranger's hand reached out, pressing against the window, and Ethan could hear a creaking sound, like metal on metal. The window cracked, and the man whispered, "You won't leave the rain." The vanishing road. Ethan's breath was shallow, his pulse racing as the stranger's hand pressed against the window. The smile never left his face. It only grew wider, stretching beyond what seemed humanly possible. His lips cracked as the grin expanded, teeth sharp and yellow, almost glowing in the dim light. Ethan froze, staring at the figure, his mind scrambling for any explanation, any reason why this man, no, this thing, was here, standing in the middle of a storm, smiling like the end of the world was at hand. His heart thudded against his chest, the weight of terror crushing his lungs. Suddenly, the window shuddered, a low metallic groan echoing through the car as the stranger pressed harder. The glass creaked under pressure. The rain seemed to stop falling just around him, leaving a strange, almost unnatural stillness hanging in the air. Ethan scrambled to push the button to raise the window, but his fingers felt numb, slipping off the button again and again. It was as if the car had locked itself, trapping him with the thing outside. The figure leaned in even closer, and Ethan could smell something putrid, a rotting scent, like decay and wet earth. It overwhelmed him, choking him, and he gagged, struggling to breathe. "You shouldn't have come here." The stranger's voice was a whisper now, so low it almost felt like it was inside his head. The words crawled through his skull, sending sharp, icy pangs of fear through his body. Who are you?" Ethan stammered, his voice trembling. He wished he could move, wished he could get away from this nightmare, but his body felt frozen, paralyzed by the presence of the figure. He couldn't explain it, but something inside him, the primal part of his brain, told him that if he didn't get out of there soon, he might never escape at all. The stranger's lips curled into a more sinister grin, his eyes never leaving Ethan's. "I am what's been waiting for you, waiting for all those who get lost in this storm." Ethan's hands were shaking uncontrollably now. He turned to look at the steering wheel, his fingers still fumbling for the keys, but his vision blurred with dread. He turned back to the stranger, and the world around him seemed to distort, stretching, warping in ways that made his head spin. Then the man stepped back, almost in slow motion, like the world was moving in a blur. For a split second, Ethan thought he was finally gone. But the entire road shifted. The familiar surroundings, the headlights that had been illuminating the stretch of highway, were no longer there. The road had become a different place entirely. There were no trees, no markings, no signs, no streetlights. Just an endless, fog-covered stretch of wet asphalt that seemed to go on forever, merging into the blackness of the storm. Ethan blinked, trying to focus, but everything was shifting. Everything around him was changing, twisting, like a fever dream. "What the hell is happening?" His voice came out shaky and desperate. The stranger wasn't there anymore, but Ethan could hear footsteps. Slow, heavy, and deliberate. They were coming from behind him. But there was no one there. Just the relentless sound of footsteps in the rain-soaked road, the squish of wet boots on the asphalt. His heart raced. He turned around, eyes wild with panic. But there was nothing except the rain, the mist, the absolute emptiness that surrounded him. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept coming, closer and closer. He snapped his head to the side, looking back at the spot where the stranger had stood. But now there was just nothing. The road stretched ahead, dark, endless, like it had always been there, waiting. For a moment, Ethan thought he might be hallucinating, that maybe he'd hit his head or was imagining it all. Maybe the storm was messing with his mind. But the footsteps didn't lie. Someone was out there. His fingers fumbled once more for the door handle. He twisted it desperately, praying that the door would open, but it was stuck. He pounded on it, his fists hitting the cold metal, but nothing. The car seemed to hold him inside as if it, too, was part of the nightmare. Trapped. The footsteps stopped. And then silence. The kind of silence that rattled your bones. But it didn't last long. There was a sudden, sharp knock on his window. The sound was so loud, so unexpected, that Ethan's heart nearly leapt out of his chest. He jumped, his body jerking in response. He looked toward the window. And there, once again, standing in the rain, was the figure. But this time, his face was different. The smile was gone. Instead, his eyes were wide open, his pupils dilated, reflecting the storm like black holes in his skull. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was a low growl now, distorted like static on a radio. The stranger raised a finger to his lips, as though shushing him. "No one is supposed to be here." Ethan could feel his heart pounding in his throat. He quickly grabbed the seatbelt, unbuckling it and throwing open the door, stumbling out into the rain. He didn't know why he thought running was the answer. Maybe it was the only thing left. Maybe he couldn't bear the suffocating presence of the thing standing before him. But as his feet hit the wet ground, he realized the road had changed again. The asphalt was now cracked and torn, as though the earth itself had shifted beneath his feet. The storm had turned into something more. The clouds overhead seemed to churn in unnatural patterns, moving faster than they should, spinning as if they were alive. Ethan's mind reeled. What was happening? He could feel it. Something was wrong, deeply, horribly wrong. The world had become a twisted, distorted version of itself. It was like he had crossed into another realm, one where the rules didn't apply, where the very air felt alive with malice. And then, in the distance, he saw something. A shadow. A shape moving through the fog. It was there, too far to make out, but somehow Ethan knew it was following him. The footsteps, those same wet, squelching footsteps, came closer again, and this time they weren't stopping. Ethan didn't look back. He ran. But no matter how fast he ran, the shadow was always there, just behind him, closing in. The whispering shadows. Ethan's feet splashed through the rain, each step feeling heavier than the last. His lungs burned with every breath, but his legs refused to stop. There was a primal fear driving him, pushing him forward even when his body begged for rest. The shadows were getting closer, and with them a deep, gnawing dread filled his chest. He didn't dare look back. Not yet. Every instinct told him to keep running, to escape whatever nightmare had wrapped itself around him. But the air around him felt thick, oppressive, like it was pushing against him, slowing him down. The footsteps, wet and muffled against the asphalt, kept coming. Thump, thump, thump. The sound was like a drumbeat, steadily growing louder. Ethan's heart raced in rhythm with it. He glanced over his shoulder for the briefest second, just enough to confirm what he feared. The shadow was still there, trailing him, an unnatural figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence like it wasn't bound by the same rules of the world. It wasn't human. Ethan could feel that truth deep in his bones. It was something more ancient, more malevolent, and it was coming for him. His mind scrambled for a plan. There had to be something, some way to escape, to fight back. He couldn't outrun it forever. Ahead, the road twisted unnaturally, curving sharply in a way that didn't make sense. The familiar stretch of highway that had once seemed endless now felt like a maze, the very path beneath him warping like a mirage. But that wasn't the worst of it. The rain, which had once been a heavy but natural downpour, began to change. Instead of water, the droplets felt thick, like tar, black and viscous. As they hit his skin, they stung with an unnatural heat. The air itself felt like it was alive, writhing and twisting around him, as if it were trying to drag him into some unseen abyss. Then a voice whispered in his ear. It was barely a sound at first, like the wind. But it became louder, clearer, as though it was inside his head, echoing through his thoughts. You can't run forever. Ethan stumbled, his feet slipping on the wet asphalt. He tried to shake the voice from his mind, but it kept creeping in, weaving through his thoughts like a vine, suffocating him. He gasped for air, his breath shallow and ragged. It knew his fear. It knew exactly what terrified him the most. The shadow was closing in faster now. Ethan could hear the wet slapping of its feet, the squelching sound growing louder with each passing second. He didn't dare look back again. Instead, he turned his gaze forward, searching for something, anything, that could offer him an escape. And there it was. A building. Far off in the distance, half obscured by the mist and rain, stood a structure that hadn't been there before. It was an old farmhouse, dilapidated and decaying, but it felt like a sanctuary. Ethan's heart leaped. That's where I need to go. But as he sprinted toward it, his legs burning, his muscles aching from the strain, he realized the distance between him and the farmhouse was growing. It was stretching. Every step he took seemed to make the building further away, like it was receding into the fog, mocking his efforts. And then, just when he thought he couldn't run any longer, the voice came again. This time it was louder, closer. You can't escape. You belong to us now. It was as if the very earth beneath him was alive, trying to drag him into the ground. Ethan's feet were sinking, the asphalt softening beneath his weight. His legs plunged deeper, and the black tar-like rain pelted down on him, soaking into his skin, burning like acid. His heart raced as he realized that he was trapped, stuck in the middle of a nightmare that was closing in around him. He struggled, pulling his feet free, but it was no use. The road had become a pit, a trap, and the more he struggled, the faster he sank. And then from the fog came the shadow once more. It moved with an unnatural grace, stepping through the mist like a specter. The man, or whatever it was, appeared in front of him, his face now completely distorted. His eyes were wide, bulging inhumanly, and his smile had twisted into something grotesque. His skin was pale, stretched tight over his bones, and his body seemed to flicker in and out of existence, like it was made of smoke. You shouldn't have looked, the figure whispered, its voice a garbled hiss that made Ethan's skin crawl. Ethan tried to scream, but his throat was dry, his voice lost in the nightmare. He reached out for the farmhouse, the only possible escape, but the ground beneath him seemed to close in, swallowing him whole. The rain was coming faster now, the black drops pounding down on him like hail, like molten stones. And then, just as he thought it was over, the shadow lunged forward. Its hand reached out, a clawed, bony finger pointing directly at him. And for the briefest moment, Ethan saw the truth. The thing that had been chasing him was not human. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching, for someone just like him to step onto this cursed road. It had been watching him all along, waiting for him to get lost, waiting for him to be trapped. You belong to us, the voice hissed again, sending a shock of ice through Ethan's veins. With everything inside him, Ethan screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive fog, lost in the infinite stretch of the cursed road. The last thing he saw was the thing's twisted smile, the eyes gleaming with malice. And then the darkness took him. The silent scream. Ethan's body was heavy, his limbs stiff and unresponsive. His chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged breaths, but his mind was trapped in a fog. The darkness that enveloped him wasn't just in the world around him, but inside his very own mind. He couldn't remember how he had gotten here. The sensation of cold earth beneath his fingers, the oppressive weight of the air around him, all felt wrong, unnatural. He tried to move, but the moment he attempted to lift his arm, an intense jolt of pain shot through his body. His muscles screamed, as if they had been twisted and pulled against their will. He couldn't move. He couldn't scream. The crushing weight of fear began to tighten around his throat. His mind was still trying to process the horror he had just witnessed. The shadow, the voice, the rain, everything. Was it real? Was this all just a nightmare, a figment of his imagination? Or was he truly trapped somewhere beyond the realm of the living? His breath came out in short, panicked gasps as his senses started to return. His hands scraped against the cold ground, trying to push himself up. But something wasn't right. The ground wasn't just hard, it was slick like wet stone. His fingers slipped, his hand brushing against something cold and metallic. He froze. What was that? He looked down at his hand, the dim light from the barely visible sky casting eerie shadows over the object he had touched. His fingers curled around it, pulling it closer. It was an old, tarnished chain, something that didn't belong in this desolate place. The chain felt oddly familiar, as if it had been waiting for him. But why? Before he could think too deeply about it, a soft, almost inaudible voice broke through the silence. Help me. The voice was distorted, crackling with static, but unmistakably human. It sounded like it was coming from just beyond his reach, too close for comfort. Was he hearing things? Or was there someone else here? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he tried to follow the voice. Help me, it whispered again, this time clearer, though it was strained, like the person on the other end of the plea was trapped. He forced his body to move, the pain in his limbs intensifying with every shift. His muscles felt like they were being ripped apart, but still he kept crawling, dragged forward by that desperate, haunting plea. It led him to an old, decrepit building, a small shack, barely standing against the elements. The wood was cracked and rotting, the windows shattered long ago. The door hung off its hinges, swaying eerily in the wind, creaking with each gust that passed. The voice stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the wind and the eerie silence that swallowed everything else. Ethan's heart thudded louder in his ears as he hesitated before the doorway, his hand still clutching the chain tightly. "Who's there?" Ethan called, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper against the night. But no one answered. The air around him grew even colder, and the silence felt suffocating. He stepped into the shack, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Inside was a scene that made his stomach churn. Dolls. Hundreds of them. Old, cracked porcelain faces stared up at him from the floor, their glass eyes reflecting the dim light. Some were broken, their limbs twisted in unnatural angles, their painted faces frozen in expressions of terror. What is this place? A cold shiver ran down Ethan's spine. The dolls felt wrong. It wasn't just that they were old and forgotten. There was something deeply disturbing about them. Their eyes seemed to follow his every movement, their vacant stares making him feel more and more like an intruder. As he stepped further into the room, his foot hit something solid. Looking down, he saw a doll lying face down, its porcelain head shattered, the remnants of its face barely visible. Beneath it, something glinted in the weak light. Ethan crouched down and reached for it. It was another chain. He recoiled, his hand jerking back as though burned. The chains, there were more of them here, hidden beneath the dolls. They were all connected, twisted together in a tangled, grotesque mass that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Then he heard it, the whisper. But this time, it wasn't just a voice. The entire room seemed to hum with a low, grating sound. It was coming from the walls, the floorboards, the very air around him. The doll's eyes seemed to glow faintly as the room began to shift. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the whispers grew louder. "You're too late." The room around him started to twist, as if reality itself was warping. The shadows grew longer, stretching toward him like claws. The walls began to close in, the wooden beams groaning as though something heavy was pressing down from above. Suddenly, he was thrown backward, crashing into the pile of dolls. Their broken bodies tangled around him, their cold, lifeless forms pinning him to the ground. He struggled, trying to pull himself free, but the more he moved, the more the dolls seemed to entangle him, their porcelain faces now cracked, their eyes staring with a cold, accusatory glare. "You can't leave," the voice whispered again, but this time it wasn't just one voice. It was hundreds of voices, all overlapping, speaking in unison, each one soaked in pain and agony. "You're one of us now." Ethan's panic surged as he fought against the mass of dolls, but it was no use. He was trapped. The ground beneath him began to give way. His hands sank into the earth, as though the ground itself was swallowing him whole. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the glowing eyes of the dolls, their faces contorted in expressions of silent, twisted laughter. And then the world went silent. The binding curse. Ethan awoke with a jolt, his body jerking upright in the suffocating darkness. His lungs burned as he gasped for air, the cold biting into his skin. His fingers scraped against something rough, an unfamiliar texture. The ground beneath him was soft, almost damp, like the earth itself was alive, pulsating beneath him. His vision blurred as he tried to make sense of his surroundings. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, the sound drowning out everything else. Where was he? He pushed himself up, his hands sinking into the ground as he staggered to his feet. The familiar weight of the chains was still wrapped around his wrist, cold and unyielding. He couldn't see where the chains led, but he could feel their presence tightening with every breath he took. Suddenly, the air grew thick, as if something was pressing down on him, suffocating him. The faint whisper of wind became a cacophony of voices, mournful, desperate, and pleading. "Help me, you must help me." The voice echoed around him, but it was different now. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, a force that seemed to reach out, trying to pull him deeper into its grip. Ethan's eyes darted around, trying to locate the source of the voice. But there was nothing, only the oppressive darkness, thick as ink, swirling around him like a storm. He couldn't tell where the ground ended and the air began. It was as if he was floating in a void. "Who are you?" He managed to croak, his throat raw, the words barely escaping his lips. There was no immediate answer, but the temperature dropped. The cold seeped into his bones, gnawing at him from the inside out. "You cannot escape," the voice whispered again, louder this time. "You are bound." He stiffened. Bound. What did that mean? He wasn't tied down physically, was he? He looked down, but his hands were free from any tangible restraints. So why did it feel like something was holding him back? A sudden, sharp pain shot through his chest, and he gasped, clutching his heart. His breath hitched as if something invisible was tightening around his chest, squeezing the life out of him. The chains are not just physical, the voice murmured. They are a curse, a binding that has been passed down for generations. You are its next victim. Ethan staggered back, his mind racing. Curse? Victim? He had heard stories, legends about ancient families cursed to suffer for their sins. But this felt far more real, far more terrifying. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the pain stopped. The darkness remained, but the grip on his chest loosened. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the ground. What do you want from me? He whispered into the void, his voice small, trembling. The voice seemed to laugh. You are already too late. Before he could respond, the ground beneath him shifted. It cracked open like a yawning chasm, sending a rush of cold air through the darkness. Ethan barely had time to react before the earth split open, and the chain wrapped around his wrist was jerked violently. No, he shouted, his body being pulled towards the opening. His feet slid across the loose earth as the chain pulled harder, dragging him closer to the abyss. His heart raced, and he clawed at the ground, trying desperately to hold on. But the pull was irresistible. The chains were alive, thrumming with a dark, malevolent energy. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. You cannot escape. Ethan felt his fingers slipping from the earth, the ground crumbling beneath him as the chasm yawned wider. Panic flooded him, his heart hammering in his chest as the darkness swirled around him. Help me, please. The voice that had been guiding him, pleading with him, now twisted into something darker. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the chasm, sending a shiver of dread down his spine. The walls of the earth pressed in on him, threatening to crush him from all sides. Suddenly, a cold hand gripped his ankle. Ethan screamed, trying to pull away, but the fingers tightened, dragging him toward the edge. He looked down, his blood running cold. There, at the bottom of the chasm, was something he couldn't comprehend, a face. It was pale, almost lifeless, its eyes wide open in silent terror. The face was that of a woman, but her features were distorted, as if she had been trapped in this place for centuries, her face frozen in an eternal scream. Please, you must help me, the woman's voice begged, the words coming from her mouth, but her lips didn't move. It is too late for me, but you can still escape. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stared into the woman's unblinking eyes. There was a pull, a connection between them that he couldn't explain. It was as if she was trying to reach out to him, warning him of the fate that awaited him if he didn't act quickly. But before he could move, the ground beneath him cracked open further. His body was yanked toward the abyss with a force that felt like it was breaking him apart. No, he screamed, but it was useless. The darkness consumed him. The unforgiving depths. The cold was unbearable. Ethan's body trembled uncontrollably as he was sucked deeper into the chasm, his body twisting and jerking in the dark void. The harsh scraping of metal against stone echoed through the air, each breath like shards of ice cutting through his lungs. His hands, once outstretched in desperation, now gripped the loose earth beneath him, fighting against an invisible force that was pulling him further into the black abyss. His fingers dug into the damp soil, but it was no use. The force was too strong, relentless. Suddenly, the earth beneath him shifted violently, sending Ethan tumbling through the darkness. He could feel the edges of the abyss closing in around him, as if the very air was alive with malice. His heart raced in his chest, his thoughts clouded with panic. And then, the world around him went silent. The suffocating pressure vanished, and the deafening rush of air ceased. It was as if the world had been swallowed whole by the dark. His limbs felt heavy, like they were made of stone, as he lay motionless on a cold, hard surface. Ethan opened his eyes, but the darkness was still absolute. He couldn't see anything, nothing but the oppressive weight of the silence that surrounded him. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, swallowed by the suffocating quiet. The answer came not in words, but in the sensation that crept up his spine, a cold, creeping presence that he could feel pressing against his back. Something was watching him. His pulse quickened, and he scrambled to his feet, his heart racing. His hands groped the air, searching for something, anything to hold on to. But there was nothing, only the darkness. The oppressive, suffocating darkness. He tried to take a step, but his foot caught on something sharp. A cry of pain escaped his lips as he stumbled forward, his hands reaching out to steady himself. His fingers brushed against something soft, something alive. His breath caught in his throat as he froze. Was it human? He reached out again, trembling, his fingertips grazing the surface. It was warm, but not like a living body. No, it felt wrong, unnatural. He recoiled instinctively, but the thing, whatever it was, moved. "Help me," a voice whispered, a soft, pleading sound that made Ethan's blood run cold. It wasn't the woman from earlier. This voice was different, deep, raspy, filled with an ancient sadness. But what struck him the most was the unmistakable sound of pain that lingered in each syllable. Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears as he dared to take a step closer, his mind swirling with confusion. Was this another spirit? Another trapped soul? "Who are you?" he called into the dark, his voice barely more than a whisper. For a long moment, there was no response. Just the deafening silence that threatened to consume him. Then, slowly, the voice returned, this time more desperate, more insistent. "You have to understand, you can't run from this." Ethan's breath caught. He could hear it now, the faintest sound, like chains dragging across the floor, the sound of something struggling against its bonds. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, his voice trembling. His legs shook beneath him, and he felt like he was going to collapse under the weight of the oppressive atmosphere. The voice seemed to laugh, a dry, broken laugh that sent chills down his spine. "You don't understand, do you?" Ethan's heart was pounding in his chest, each beat threatening to burst from his ribcage. His skin crawled as if something unseen was brushing against him, just out of reach. He tried to move, to escape the voice, but it clung to him. It wrapped itself around him like an invisible shroud, dragging him further into the depths of this place. "You're already a part of it," the voice continued, its tone slow and deliberate. "You were always meant to be here." The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the weight of what he had just heard. He had always known something was wrong. Something dark had been lurking just beneath the surface of this nightmare. But now, it felt as though it was all coming to a head. He was bound to the curse. But how? His thoughts raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of his past. His family, his ancestors, the stories he had heard growing up. They weren't just stories, they were warnings. Warnings that no one had taken seriously. The voice in the dark continued. "It was always your fate, Ethan. The curse was set long before you were born. And now you will join us." Ethan's stomach twisted with dread. He didn't know what the voice meant, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay here. He couldn't let this be the end. He had to fight. His heart hammered in his chest as he began to crawl, blindly reaching out with his hands in the dark. His fingers brushed against the cold, rough walls around him, each movement like a desperate attempt to hold onto some shred of hope. He could hear the voice growing louder now, urging him to stop, urging him to give in. But Ethan pushed on. He didn't know how long he had been crawling, how much time had passed. It felt like hours or maybe days. But he was determined. He would find a way out. And then he saw it. A faint light, far off in the distance. It was small, flickering, but it was real. The first sign of escape. He surged forward, his limbs shaking with exhaustion, his mind spinning with fear. But the light, it was getting closer. "Ethan, don't," the voice warned, its tone desperate, pleading. "You cannot leave. You belong to us." But Ethan ignored it, pushing himself harder, faster, his body screaming in protest. He couldn't stop now. With one final, desperate push, he reached the light. He stumbled forward, his hands outstretched, his body collapsing into it. And then he was gone. The haunting revelation. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He gasped for air, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession. The light he had seen, the one that had seemed like salvation, was now gone, replaced by an oppressive blackness that smothered him from all sides. His body trembled as though the weight of the darkness itself had pressed him into the cold ground. What is happening?" His voice cracked, his throat dry and burning as he struggled to push himself upright. His limbs felt heavy, almost as if they belonged to someone else. The silence was deafening. For a moment, he wondered if he had truly escaped, or if he had simply fallen deeper into the trap set for him. His mind reeled, the memory of his struggle still fresh, but the light, the hope, was gone. Instead, it had been replaced by something far worse. An eerie hum vibrated through the air, the sound thick and suffocating. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing. Ethan wiped the sweat from his brow, his hand trembling. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. His body felt wrong, disjointed, as though something had shifted, something fundamental had changed while he was in the dark. "You're still here, Ethan." The voice came from behind him, so close, too close. Ethan spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his chest. There, in the dark, stood a figure. Tall, thin, shrouded in shadow. Its features were obscured, but Ethan could feel the eyes burning into him. The air around the figure shimmered, as though it wasn't entirely real. "Who are you?" Ethan gasped, his voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, it took a step closer, its movement unnervingly fluid, unnatural. It didn't walk, not in the way any living creature would. It floated, gliding toward him with an impossible speed. "You should have never come here," it said, its voice a low rasp that made Ethan's blood run cold. His pulse hammered in his ears as the figure came closer, its presence suffocating. The walls around them seemed to close in, the shadows twisting and writhing in unnatural shapes. The voice spoke again, and Ethan could feel its words like a physical force pressing against him. "This is your fault," it hissed. "You opened the door. You released us." Ethan's mind reeled. What door? What had he released? His thoughts scrambled as he tried to recall anything that might explain what was happening. But all he could remember was the hole, the chasm, the pull into the dark. The figure continued to move, its face slowly becoming more defined. He could see the outline of a twisted, contorted face. A face that seemed like it had been drawn from nightmares. A face that was human but grotesque, features distorted as if by some cruel, invisible hand. The eyes, hollow and endless, stared into his soul. "You cannot escape," the figure whispered, its voice now a raspy, guttural growl. "The curse will follow you. Always." Ethan stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his mind spiraling out of control. The room, if it could even be called a room, seemed to close in around him, and the very walls pulsed with a sickening energy. Who are you?" Ethan demanded, though his voice wavered with fear. The figure tilted its head, and for a moment there was silence. Then, in a voice that was no longer a whisper but a deafening screech, it answered. "We are the ones you have woken." A deep, unsettling chill ran through Ethan as the words sank in. Woken? Had he truly done something? His mind raced to understand, but the terror clawed at him, preventing any coherent thought. "You must finish it." The figure's voice turned sharp, demanding. "You must embrace it." The air around him seemed to twist violently, the shadows deepening, thickening. Ethan felt himself being pulled, dragged, as though invisible hands were seizing his very soul. No, he couldn't give in. He wouldn't. With everything left in him, Ethan struggled against the unseen force. His hands clutched the cold, slimy walls of the room, his fingers scraping against them in desperation. He gasped for breath, but the air was thick, stifling, as if it was being sucked from his lungs. "You have no choice," the voice mocked, growing louder, more oppressive. His vision blurred as the room around him began to spin. Ethan's legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. But even as he lay there, helpless, the darkness consumed him. The weight of the figure's words pressed down on him like a physical force. "You have to face it, Ethan. You have to face what you have unleashed." Ethan's mind began to unravel, each thought slipping through his fingers like sand. He had no idea what was happening, what he had done to deserve this. And then, in the deepest part of the darkness, he heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Someone or something was approaching. The depths of darkness. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest, his every breath labored as the shadows closed in around him. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the sheer terror that gripped him. The footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed in the suffocating silence of the room. His eyes darted around, searching for any escape, any way out, but the walls seemed to stretch endlessly into the void, closing him in with no hope of freedom. The figure loomed above him, its form now almost fully solid, the grotesque face twisted in a cruel, mocking grin. Its eyes, those empty, soulless pits, burned into Ethan's very soul, dredging up the deepest of his fears. He wanted to scream, to run, but his body refused to obey. The terror was too overwhelming, too suffocating. It was as if his very existence was being erased, piece by piece. And then, from the corner of his vision, he saw movement. A figure, human but distorted, emerged from the shadows. Ethan could barely make it out, but it was unmistakable. The figure was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow like those of the creature before him. She stepped closer, each movement slow and deliberate, her feet making no sound against the cold, wet floor. The air around her seemed to shimmer, as if reality itself was bending in her presence. "You can never escape," the woman's voice echoed, though her lips did not move. It was as if the words came from everywhere, surrounding him. "You are part of this now. Forever." Ethan's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. His breath came in shallow gasps, his skin clammy with sweat. The room, the whole world, felt like it was collapsing in on him. His heart thudded against his ribs, the sound deafening in the silence. His eyes darted from the woman to the figure that still towered over him. Was this real? Or was he trapped in some twisted nightmare? "Why me?" Ethan managed to croak, his voice barely audible. "What do you want from me?" The woman's head tilted, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer. The oppressive darkness seemed to grow thicker around her, suffocating the very air he breathed. She reached out, her hand stretching toward him like a claw, her fingers long and unnatural. The room began to spin, the walls swirling, distorting, as if they were alive, watching him. "You opened the door," the woman replied, her voice soft and venomous. "And now you must pay the price." Ethan's breath hitched in his throat as the full weight of her words sank in. The door he had seen, felt, when he had ventured deeper into the house. The door he had opened, unknowingly unleashing something far darker than he could ever comprehend. He had been a fool. "I didn't mean to," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing." The woman's lips curled into a cruel smile, but there was no warmth in it. Only malice. Her fingers inched closer to his face, and with each passing second, Ethan could feel the temperature of the room drop, the air thickening until it was almost suffocating. "You never know, do you?" she hissed, her voice now a low growl. "You never know the cost of your curiosity, the price of your actions." Ethan closed his eyes, trying to block out the suffocating weight of her presence. But the moment he did, the world around him twisted violently, the ground beneath him shifting like quicksand. He could feel the darkness pulling him in, dragging him deeper into its grasp. He was trapped. There was no escape. "You've done it now," the woman whispered, her breath hot against his ear. "You've woken them all." Ethan's eyes shot open, panic rising in his chest. He turned toward the figure, the one that had been standing silently by, watching, waiting. Its eyes were now fixed on him, glowing faintly in the dark, and the air around it seemed to warp, like a heat wave shimmering on a scorching day. It was no longer just a figure. It was something more. Something ancient. The woman stepped back, vanishing into the shadows, but her presence lingered, her words hanging in the air like an insidious promise. "You will never escape. You will never be free." Ethan's mind raced as he struggled to understand what was happening. His legs shook, and he stumbled back, his body refusing to cooperate. The oppressive weight of the darkness seemed to grow heavier, smothering him, crushing him. The figure loomed closer, its form now a twisted mass of shadow and light, its eyes burning brighter with each step. "You think you can escape," the figure growled, its voice deep and guttural. "But you cannot. You will never leave." Ethan's heart raced in his chest, his pulse hammering against his ears. He tried to move, to run, but his legs wouldn't respond. The air was thick with dread, suffocating him, holding him in place. He could feel the darkness closing in around him, pressing down on him, crushing him beneath its weight. "This is your fate," the figure hissed, its voice now a low, vibrating growl. "You are ours now." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure reached out, its hands long and skeletal, its fingers curling toward him like claws. He could feel the coldness emanating from its touch, seeping into his skin, freezing him from the inside out. He wanted to scream, but his voice was lost, swallowed by the overwhelming darkness. And then, as the figure's claws brushed against his skin, a flash of light pierced the room, blinding him. The final confrontation. The blinding light dissipated, and Ethan was left gasping for air, his body numb, as if he'd been frozen in time. His heart thudded violently against his chest, but for a moment, everything was eerily still. The oppressive darkness had lifted, replaced by a harsh, cold light that seemed to wash away the shadows that had plagued him. Yet, it wasn't the relief he'd hoped for. It was worse. The light revealed a scene far darker than the one he had just escaped. He was no longer in the room with the figure. He was in a different place, an abandoned hospital hallway, dimly lit by flickering bulbs that hummed ominously. The walls were stained with a sickly yellow hue, and the floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid that glimmered unnaturally under the dim lights. The stench of decay filled the air, as if the very walls were rotting, disintegrating into nothingness. Ethan's pulse quickened. He knew he wasn't alone. He turned around sharply, eyes scanning the empty hallway. The silence was deafening, pressing down on him with unbearable weight. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A shadow moved, just out of reach, its form quick and erratic. Ethan stumbled back, his heart skipping a beat. The figure was there, always watching, always lurking. "You think you can escape, Ethan?" the voice rasped, crawling into his mind, so close he could almost feel it pressing against his skull. "You opened the door. And now you belong to us." Ethan spun around, his eyes wide with panic, but the hallway stretched endlessly before him. The walls seemed to twist and contort, as if mocking his futile attempt to escape. He was trapped, his every movement a desperate attempt to outrun the encroaching darkness. Suddenly, the lights flickered again, and the hallway stretched impossibly long, growing wider and more distorted with each passing second. He could hear the footsteps now, slow, deliberate, the sound of something dragging itself through the darkness. Ethan's stomach churned as he realized he was no longer alone in the hallway. The presence was there, just behind him, getting closer with every step. "I didn't mean to," Ethan whispered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know. I didn't know any of this was real." The figure's laughter echoed through the hallway, low and guttural, reverberating off the walls. "You never do you? You always think you can control it, but once the door is opened, there is no going back." Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure finally emerged from the shadows. It was tall, its skin pale and stretched tight across its skeletal frame. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin, teeth sharp and jagged, dripping with malice. The air around it shimmered, thick with an unsettling energy, and the temperature dropped, making Ethan's breath visible in the cold, stagnant air. "You can't outrun us, Ethan." The figure's voice was a mixture of mockery and disdain. "You will never leave this place. You will never escape the nightmare you have unleashed." Ethan's legs shook, but he forced himself to move, running down the hall, his steps echoing in the silence. But the figure was always there, just behind him, its footsteps heavy and sure, as if it had all the time in the world. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor beneath him became slick with more of that dark, viscous liquid. He stumbled, falling to his knees, but the figure was there before he could recover, standing over him, its grin widening as it loomed. "This is your fate now," it hissed, its hand reaching toward Ethan's throat. "There is no escape. No redemption." Ethan gasped, choking on the air that seemed to grow thinner with each passing second. The figure's hand tightened around his throat, pulling him up until his feet dangled above the floor. His vision blurred, the edges of the world growing darker as he fought to breathe, his body convulsing in the grip of death. But just as everything seemed to slip away, a voice, soft and familiar, whispered from somewhere deep within the darkness. "Ethan." The voice was his mother's. His eyes snapped open, and for a split second the darkness receded. He saw her, her face calm and serene, her eyes filled with love and sorrow. "You have to fight," her voice urged him. "You have to fight for yourself." Ethan's body, fueled by an overwhelming surge of desperation, reacted. His hands gripped the figure's arm with whatever strength he had left. "No," he gasped. "I will not let you win." With every ounce of willpower, he twisted his body, breaking free from the figure's grasp. He fell to the ground, gasping for air, the world around him spinning. His mother's voice lingered in his mind, a beacon of hope amidst the suffocating darkness. The figure snarled, its face twisting in rage. "You cannot win, Ethan," it spat. "You are mine. All of you." But Ethan, driven by something deeper than fear, pushed himself to his feet. He didn't know how much longer he could survive in this nightmare, but one thing was certain. He would not give up without a fight. With his heart pounding in his chest, he ran, not knowing where the hallway would take him, but determined to find a way out. To escape. To survive. The figure's laughter echoed behind him, but Ethan didn't look back. He couldn't afford to. The final revelation. The pounding in Ethan's chest echoed in his ears as he stumbled through the abandoned hallway, each footstep more desperate than the last. The flickering lights above him grew erratic, casting long, twisted shadows along the walls. The figure's laughter still rang in his ears, but he refused to listen. He couldn't stop now, not when he was so close. The temperature dropped further, the air thick with a strange, oppressive energy. He could feel the darkness around him, pressing in from all sides, but he pushed forward, his breaths ragged, his legs shaky but resolute. The hallway stretched on endlessly, an infinite maze of decay and despair. It felt like he was running in circles, trapped in some cruel, unending nightmare. But then, through the gloom, something caught his eye, a door slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light leaked through the gap, inviting him toward it. Ethan's heart leapt with hope. He knew deep down that it wasn't just a door. It was his way out, the answer, his salvation. He rushed toward it, his hands shaking as he gripped the cold metal handle. For a moment he hesitated, his breath coming in shallow gasps. He could feel the figure behind him, always lurking, always watching. But this was it. He had no choice. With a grunt of effort, he shoved the door open. The moment he stepped through, the oppressive atmosphere lifted. The dark, claustrophobic hallway faded away, replaced by a bright, sterile room. The walls were white, clean, and untouched. For a brief second, it almost felt like he had entered another world entirely. A world of calm, of normality, of safety. But then he heard it. A voice. "You shouldn't have come here, Ethan." The voice was soft but unmistakable. It was his mother's voice. No, it was her. The thing that had been haunting him for weeks, feeding on his guilt and fears. The figure that had followed him through every dark corner of his life. It was here, in this room. Ethan spun around, his eyes wide in shock. The room wasn't as it seemed. The white walls began to warp, twisting into something far darker, more sinister. The floor cracked beneath him, and the sterile air turned thick with the smell of rot. He realized, with a sickening dread, that the room wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. And then the figure appeared, his mother's face, but distorted, a grotesque mockery of the woman he had once loved. Her eyes were hollow, the skin stretched tight over her skull, her lips curled into an inhuman grin. She stood at the center of the room, her arms outstretched, as if waiting for him to fall into her embrace. "Welcome home, Ethan." The figure's voice rasped through the room, cold and venomous. Ethan's heart raced, his mind swirling with confusion. This couldn't be real. It couldn't. But everything felt too real. He reached out, his hands trembling, but before he could make contact, the figure's arms shot forward, grabbing him by the throat with terrifying speed. The room spun as Ethan struggled against the grip, his vision blurring, his breath caught in his throat. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The figure's face loomed closer, inches from his own, its eyes gleaming with malice. "You were never meant to leave," the figure hissed. "This is your fate, Ethan. Your punishment." Ethan fought back the panic rising in his chest, focusing on the anger, the rage that had been building inside him since the very beginning. He couldn't let this thing win. He couldn't let it consume him. With all the strength he could muster, he twisted his body, wrenching free from the figure's grasp. The room seemed to distort as he moved, everything warping around him, as if reality itself was unraveling. Ethan stumbled backward, his eyes wide with fear and determination. He couldn't fight this thing. Not with strength alone. He needed something else. Then, in that moment of clarity, something clicked. The key. The door. The truth. He had opened the door, but it wasn't just a way out. It was the beginning of the end. The figure had been feeding off his fear, his guilt, his insecurities. It was born from the very trauma that had haunted him for years. The darkness that had followed him since childhood. And now he had to face it. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," Ethan whispered, his voice shaking but strong. "I'm not afraid." The figure's grin faltered, just for a moment, as if uncertain. It recoiled, the grip on his throat loosening. Ethan seized the opportunity. His hands trembled as he reached for the figure, not to fight, but to forgive. "I forgive you," he said softly, his voice steady, despite the fear clawing at his insides. "I forgive myself." The room shuddered violently. The walls cracked and splintered, and the light flickered, growing brighter, blinding. The figure howled, its form distorting, its screams of fury echoing through the room as if the very air was ripping apart. Ethan could feel the darkness retreating, like a tide pulling away from him, as if the very essence of fear was being drained from the room. The last thing he saw before the light consumed everything was the figure's face, twisted, angry, but vanishing, dissolving into nothingness. And then silence. When Ethan opened his eyes, he found himself standing in the middle of the empty hospital hallway once again. The air was clean, the smell of decay gone. The walls were intact, no longer rotting away. The darkness had lifted. He wasn't sure if it was all a dream, a hallucination, or if he had really confronted the thing that had been haunting him for so long. But one thing was certain, he had faced his fears, and he had survived. And maybe, just maybe, he had found a way to move on. The end.